Welcome to the Intuitive Health Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Rafferty, medical doctor, PhD, shaman, and Reiki intuitive healer. I'm here to bring you on a journey of holistic healing that explores the science of the physical body combined with mental and emotional well-being, energetic and spiritual health. So today we are going to be exploring all things menstrual cycle. And I'm hoping that this appeals to people that are born with wombs. Generally speaking, throughout the course of this episode, I use the term women. But I do acknowledge that not everybody that is born with a womb actually identifies as female. And I'm also hoping that men that are listening to this really learn and empower themselves to understand what their partners, mothers, sisters, friends are going through every single month, every single cycle. So I'm super excited to touch on topics I feel are really important to empower women, to honor women, and to help them to recognize the power that they hold by tuning into their bodies, their emotions, tuning into the energy that they hold in the body. And to bring us on that journey, I'm actually going to tap in this first episode of this series into the physical body primarily. And then we'll go on over the next couple of weeks to take a bit of a deeper dive into other aspects of our being. And I really felt like I wanted to bring it back to the physical body initially so that we can tune in to the ebbs and the flows and the cycles of what's happening within the physical body. And women are so incredible. I've been fascinated with how the hormonal cascade works in the women's body for the whole time that I've been doing my medical studies, for the whole time I've been doing my medical work, and the fact that you can even grow a baby from two tiny cells inside a uterus just absolutely blows my mind. So, I spent some time in Australia at the Women's Hospital, in the UK, in Ireland here at the National Maternity Hospital, and the power and the strength that women have, it's actually just mind-blowing to me. And I really want to honor that over the next couple of weeks by going on this journey with you guys. So today we're going to really touch base with the menstrual cycle. So a lot of clients that come through the door, it really kind of has made me realize that people think that there's a period of bleeding once a month for many. That might not be the case for everybody, but that there's this kind of window or period in between where people aren't really sure what's happening in the body. People aren't really sure what even menstruation is. So I want to empower women and hopefully men listening to this to learn about the complexity and the cascades of all the different emotions and how to live or sync your life and your diet with your menstrual cycle to optimize your health and well-being and how the body functions. Because on a minute to minute, hour to hour, day by day trajectory, the hormonal cascades that are happening within the women's body is absolutely huge and very fluctuant. And at various stages in the cycle, you can have variations in your metabolic rate, the amount of calories you need to be eating, your appetite, how you exercise. And, they're only to touch base with a few of the bits and pieces that are going on in the body at that during those different stages and different cycles within the hormonal profile. And a lot of people don't realize that actually these are hugely impactful things within someone's life on a day-to-day basis. So when we actually tap into the body, when we get in tune with how the hormones are working, and we actually have a good idea of what's happening within the menstrual cycle, we can live in harmony with our body, in harmony with our hormones. So just to bring it actually back to basics about what the menstrual cycle actually is. Now, it varies from person to person, but typically speaking, we say that the menstrual cycle is a 28-day period on average. Now, this can vary, and it varies depending on the sources that you look at. But generally speaking, it's thought that between 23 and 35 days are normal. They are extremes, though, within the normal range, and anything outside that is abnormal or warranting some investigation. And some people basically may actually skip menstrual cycles and may not get them every month. And that's really important, that if you're experiencing things like that outside the normal range, it's imperative to go and have that investigated, because there could be an underlying health condition. So the menstrual cycle starts when we basically first go into puberty, and women experience menarche, which is the first period. It often occurs between the ages of 9 to 12 years old is on average. That's the first period that happens. The body then goes into this cyclical pattern that every month you will go through a menstrual cycle. Now, generally speaking, what happens is the first day of the bleed is termed the first day of the menstrual period. And from that day forward, you go through a few key stages in the menstrual cycle. So you can roughly break the menstrual cycle down into two key periods. One is the follicular period, when your follicles are developing in order for an egg to be released. When the egg is released, that's called ovulation. And then you go into the other end of the spectrum with the menstrual cycle, in which you go through the luteal phase. And I'm going to take a deeper dive now into each of those stages. So within the follicular phase, and that's roughly the first 14 days of the period, you can actually break that down further into the menstruation period, followed by the period in which the follicles are really getting their groove on in order to grow and release the egg. So what is menstruation? Menstruation is when you're actually shedding the lining of the uterus. So we call that the endometrium. And it is basically when you have your bleed. So when you are bleeding, you will have blood loss, you'll have tissue loss, you'll have mucus that is being expelled from the uterus and the cervix and the vagina. So some women actually feel like they're losing an awful lot of liquid during that time. And it's actually quite important to kind of get an idea of how much fluid loss you are losing during that time, because some women have very, very heavy periods. And, that can be an indication that there, again, is an underlying health condition going on. So what's actually normal when it comes down to a bleed? Essentially, is research out there that would suggest about 30 to 40 mils, which is 2 to 3 tablespoons, is normal. However, research would suggest that some women actually can lose up to 60 mils, which is 4 tablespoons of loss during that period. However, there is some interesting research that's kind of starting to identify that potentially only up to 36% of that is blood. It's actually the other components in the fluid that make up the majority of what you're losing. But all in all, it's important to know the volume of what you're losing. So how do you do that? How do you calculate it? So essentially, some women use menstrual cups in which they can actually measure the amount of loss that's occurring. And there's often measurements on the side of the cup. You can look at how many mils you lose during the period of bleed. But you can also use your tampons, if you use tampons, to kind of gauge how much you're losing. So a normal tampon generally holds about 5 mils of fluid. A super tampon will hold up to 10 mils. So over the course of a bleed, if you're losing up to 60 mils of fluid, you're looking at about 6 to 12 tampons as being normal. Generally speaking, if you have very heavy periods, we call that something called menorrhagia. And generally speaking, if you're losing over 80 mils of blood or bleeding for longer than 7 days, that would suggest that something's not quite right there. So they're good little markers or kind of guides as to what may or may not be normal within that period. So it's really important to kind of tune into the body, tune into your menstruation, and see what's going on for you there. So some of you listening to this may be squirming in your seat that I'm even talking about mucus and discharge and all of these things that change in the menstrual cycle. And I often see this in clinical practice that a lot of women carry a lot of shame around what's actually completely and utterly normal. It has happened to all women throughout all lifetimes. And, it's really interesting because if you're going into that space where you're kind of like squirming a little bit in your seat when I'm talking about bleeding or mucus or discharge, it's important to kind of focus in on where you're feeling that in the body and think to yourself, am I holding some shame around this beautiful, uh, link to my femininity and my beautiful energy that I hold within the body? And I often see that a lot of women that carry a lot of shame, they have tight hips, they have issues within the lower energy centers within the body because of that deep shame. So, some traditions and cultures actually view the menstrual period as this beautiful opportunity to have a ceremony with themselves, a ceremony with the womb, ceremony with the body. And it's often related when we are in flow, in attunement with Mother Earth, with the moon. We tend to see a lot of women get their periods around the time of the full moon. And I really love these concepts, and we've really lost touch with a lot of this through a lot of Western society and cultural conditioning these days. That we scurry away to the bathroom. People have their period. They might carry tampons in their purse that they don't want anybody to see, and they hide those things away, the products away afterwards. And it's just associated with so much secrecy and shame in so many ways. Whereas when we actually embrace and embody this beautiful transitional nature of the body, it can be so empowering and it can be so magic. And, for people who actually collect their menstrual blood in moon cups or these little collection devices, there are some traditions and some people around the world that will actually add all of that up. They can see what's happening within the body. They're in touch with the fluid. They're in touch with their body, and they'll offer that back to the land as a ceremonial offering at the end of their bleed. And, I love that people are connecting with the bodies, connecting with the physicality of what the vulva, the vagina, everything looks like, how it feels, how the fluids are changing and ebbing and flowing within the body in relation to the menstrual hormone cycle. And I just love that. I love that people are going deeper into this connection within the body. So, menstruation typically lasts for about between 3 and 7 days. You have roughly about 450 cycles or menstrual periods over 30 to 40 years, which I find just fascinating. And then you enter into the menopause period where essentially you run out of eggs in the ovary. And typically speaking, you then go into a period of time when you're not having any bleeds any further. So by definition, we say that it's the absence of a period for 12 months or more. It generally is considered to be occur on average age of 51, but you can experience the menopausal symptoms, perimenopausal symptoms, for up to 4 months or 10 years before you actually have a menopause. So it's really interesting. It's really diverse in how people experience a bleed, and it's important to kind of tune in and touch base with what's happening in the body. Now, what's really important and really interesting about menstruation is the shedding, the loss of this endometrium or the lining of the womb. There's a lot of inflammation going on during that stage. And it's important that we try and eat in order to reduce the inflammation, because food can be medicine, it can be anti-inflammatory. But in order for us to do that, we have to eat certain foods that will support that. In addition, we're also going through this period or rise in estrogen levels during that time. And there are foods that you can eat to support the production of estrogen. So at the very beginning of your menstruation, your hormones are going to be bottomed out. You'll have very little hormone activity going on because the body is like, okay, we're releasing everything here. A pregnancy didn't occur, and everything has kind of plummeted at that stage. So, as you move further into this follicular phase, during your bleed, your estrogen levels will begin to rise. So, we can support this with certain foods. So, certain foods that I love to recommend during this period includes cruciferous vegetables. They contain indole 3 carbinol, which supports estrogen metabolism. You also can take flax seeds, which have lignans, which support estrogen production as well. And then obviously things like leafy greens, beans and legumes, they're really rich in iron. So if you're bleeding, you will be losing iron. So it's really important to support iron production with certain foods. So, when we're trying to actually increase our iron intake, which is super important around this time of menstruation, a lot of healthcare providers, a lot of advice you'll find online is that just eat more red meat. But there are a lot of amazing plant based sources of iron that we can include in the diet in order to support iron production. And the reason that I'm kind of suggesting the more plant based sources is because there are so many phytonutrients, there are so many benefits to the fiber that are also in the plant based sources of iron that will actually support your gut health at the same time. And the gut is imperative for hormone cycling with regard to our. The hormones that are associated with the menstrual cycle. It regulates estrogen, but it also regulates thyroid function, which is huge on a fertility journey and for general health and well-being as well. So that's why I tend to typically optimize the amount of plants that are in the diet, and why I typically tend to recommend plant-based iron sources. That doesn't mean that if you're craving something that is animal-based products that you shouldn't work intuitively with your body on that, but it's always good to optimize how we're improving our hormone health in relation to our gut health, and that's through the consumption of plant-based sources of fiber. One amazing thing that we can do to support iron production is have vitamin C with iron sources. So, for example, if you're eating things like hummus or chickpeas, they're a lovely source of iron. Squeeze in some lemon over that, a lovely source of vitamin C. Vitamin C will help with iron absorption. Things that prevent iron absorption are caffeine in and around meal times. Now, coffee is a stimulant, and sometimes reducing the amount of stimulation you have from coffee can be good during that kind of menstruation time. Also, things that reduce inflammation with regard to foods can be omega-3 fatty acids. So, lovely sources of those can be obviously supplementation with omega-3, but natural sources, things like walnuts, chia seeds, flax again, which I love, they're all really good sources. Hemp seeds, good sources of omega-3. Also, things like algal oil supplements or seaweed during that time. Berries are also wonderful antioxidants, and recommend the inclusion of those during the menstrual period. Things to avoid includes anything that's going to cause inflammation, which is like fatty or fried foods as well. So, really just taking a little look when you're actually during your period. How can I optimize the support for my womb while it's shedding, but also support estrogen production? So when you come out the other side of your menstrual period, you're entering fully into that follicular stage. And then when I say follicular, what does that mean? So the ovary contains loads of little follicles. Women are born with all of the follicles and eggs that they're going to have for their whole life, which blows my mind. So every month you'll get a couple of follicles begin to develop. They'll start to come towards the surface of the ovary, and then there'll be one winner usually that will basically outcompete the other follicles, will have lots of little receptors on it that respond to other chemicals that are being released in the body that allows it to grow big and strong. And then hopefully, all going well with the hormonal cascades in the body, that will be triggered to release a mature oocyte or egg from the follicle that will head down your fallopian tube, be met by sperm, if that's what you're hoping for, to create an embryo that goes on to implant in the uterine wall. Now, what's really interesting is you're getting lots of estrogen production at this stage. The estrogen is produced by these gorgeous little cells that surround the follicle. And essentially, you're getting more and more estrogen production. It's getting super exciting there in the ovary. And you're also feeling quite good during this stage because estrogen has an amazing effect on basically every cell in the body. And it's actually when you enter into menopause and you have no more eggs in the ovary, no more follicles that are going to produce an ovum. You don't have any estrogen being produced. The amount of estrogen completely drops off, declines, and all the cells in the body begin screaming out. They're like, oh God, where's the estrogen? And there's so many impacts with regard to this kind of drop off in estrogen when you're entering into the menopausal stage in life. So it's no wonder that when you're going through this follicular phase and you're getting all this estrogen produced, that you're like, oh my God, I'm feeling good. I'm feeling good. I'm coming up to kind of ovulation stage, and I'm ready to take on the world. And some of the research that's been done on athletes say that actually the week after their period is when they feel most energized, most productive, and they feel strong. Typically speaking, the follicular phase lasts up until ovulation. Now, during this stage, when the estrogen is surging, you're getting a thickness building up within the endometrium, which is the lining of the womb. So what the body is essentially doing is it's creating this lovely little cushiony bed for the hopeful embryo to implant into. But it's interesting because as the body is going through that period with this rise in estrogen and this kind of prepping of the uterine lining, it's kind of calling out for kind of, an increase in some carbohydrates, but you may feel actually that your appetite is decreased. You're kind of thinking, actually, I'm not that hungry. And that's completely normal. But it's important during this phase, this follicular phase, to actually continue to support your estrogen production with the foods that I have mentioned, so that basically you can fuel the production of all these gorgeous, happy, and healthy hormones. So in a 28-day cycle, you will then reach the point in which ovulation occurs. So as I mentioned, there's all these other chemical cascades going on with the body, within the body in response to this rising estrogen production. And all of a sudden, you'll reach a point in which the estrogen reaches a peak. It will trigger a specific hormone to be released from the brain, which causes your mature follicle now to pop out the egg at ovulation. And ovulation typically occurs on day 14. You'll notice that in and around that time, you may have temperature changes in the body. You'll get a rise in your temperature. You might be craving more proteins during that time. We will also get a surge in testosterone production in and around the ovulation time. Testosterone is great for muscle building activities. So as you're approaching the days leading up to ovulation, that week before you ovulate, you'll be feeling stronger. Weight bearing exercise, strength conditioning in the gym, they're really good times to be doing those type of activities. So generally speaking, you'll get a change in the mucus production in the body because of the subtle changes that are happening in the hormones. So you may notice that when you're walking, you may feel in and around the ovulation time a little bit slippery or wet down below. And the mucus changes in consistency at the time of ovulation. So for those trying to conceive, it's always really good to kind of track your mucus during your ovulation times, so that you can get a good idea as to when is a good time to be having intercourse, to optimize your chance of success. Generally speaking, around days 11 to 15 of a 28-day cycle are when you're most fertile. And a fascinating fact that I learned during medical school is that sperm can survive for up to 5 days in the female reproductive tract. So just keep in mind that those little swimmers can be hanging around for up to 5 days, potentially essentially fertilizing an egg. So essentially what happens is the egg pops out of the ovary, then heads off down the fallopian tube, hoping to look for a few sperm. But the little follicle or the sac that the egg popped out of, that actually remains in the ovary and transforms into something called the corpus luteum. Now, that's why we call the next phase of the menstrual cycle the luteal phase. It's the corpus luteum or luteal phase, because the corpus luteum then goes on to begin producing progesterone. So you'll notice that there's a distinct decrease in your estrogen at the time of ovulation. And then you'll begin to get these surges of progesterone in order to support the endometrial lining, or the little cushiony lining inside of the womb that has built up in order to take in the little embryo that's hopefully going to arise. Now, this lasts for about 14 days, and the last day is the day before your menstrual period will start again. Typically speaking, the luteal phase tends to be quite regular. You tend to get a luteal phase that lasts for up to 14 days with each cycle. Whereas if you actually have variations in the cycle lengths from month to month, it tends to be the follicular phase that kind of changes more so than the luteal phase. Now, for people that are on a fertility journey, I love when people track their cycles, because I want to know what the luteal phase is doing. Because if you have a short luteal phase, sometimes you're not getting adequate progesterone production in order to support a successful implantation and the early stages of embryo development. So that's why I always love to bring people back to the body. When we tune into the body, it tells us so much about what's going on and where we can tweak or help things to optimize what's right for you. So like I was saying, that lasts up to 14 days. And we notice that basically during the luteal phase, there's an increase in appetite. You're beginning to produce progesterone. The body's kind of getting into a phase where it's kind of going, oh, I'm hoping that an embryo will come along and implant here. How can we support that? You will notice that there's an increase in your calorie requirement, your metabolic rate increases, and all of these things get taken for granted a lot of the time, because you're starting to think, oh, I'm feeling a bit hungry. You know, you might feel a little bit grumpy, but your metabolism is actually crying out for more calories and you're not giving it to them. So there's loads of things you can do to support this phase of your journey. And generally speaking, what I recommend is increasing your intake of magnesium-rich foods. Now, you can also take in magnesium supplements, but magnesium-rich foods are really important because magnesium supports progesterone production. Things you can get magnesium from are things like nuts and seeds, dark chocolate. They're really good sources. So no wonder you're craving chocolate when you're just coming up on your next period. But also it's important to increase the amount of healthy fats in the diet. So nuts and seeds, dark chocolate, they're all great sources of magnesium, fat, antioxidants within the dark chocolate. But also avocados are great. They're a source of healthy fats. They also have vitamin E for hormonal balance and synthesis. So things like that can really help to improve your progesterone production and bring you back into a really healthy balance within the body. Now, progesterone sometimes gets vilified because of how it makes us feel in the second phase of the cycle. But it's something that needs to be held with great softness because, you know, there's elements of how we live our life that can impact how progesterone is produced. And when we're going hard during those times, when we're working hard, when we're stressed out, sometimes people do intermittent fasting. That can be wonderful at certain stages in the cycle. But, you know, during your luteal phase, intermittent fasting can actually impact the amount of progesterone that's produced if you're doing very long fasts. So I'd encourage you to really mind yourself. Slow down. Do things like yoga if you're choosing to exercise. Come into the body. Take walks. Don't be putting too much stress on the body. And if you're craving the dark chocolate, eat it. You know? I tend to recommend that as progesterone surges during this time, activities like yoga, especially when you're entering into your next menstrual cycle, they're wonderful activities to be doing during those times. Bring you back to the body, providing a bit of softness and kindness to the body while it's preparing for and going through a bleed. Now, the thing is, when you're actually bleeding, I tend to recommend movement. So if you're someone that regularly moves, I wouldn't stop moving. However, if you are being confined to the bed with your period, I think you need to be seeing someone at that stage. But generally speaking, movement, exercise, it will help and reduce the symptoms that you experience during your menstrual cycle. So, generally speaking, they are the main phases of the menstrual cycle. And I'm hoping that that has given people a little bit of understanding and background to what's happening in the body as you enter into the first stage, which is your menstrual cycle, generally lasting from 3 to 7 days. Entering deeply into the follicular phase, then as the follicles grow and develop to release the egg, then entering into ovulation on day 14, which is then followed by the luteal phase, where you get your surges or your rise in progesterone. And it's important to kind of nourish and help the body during each of those stages and recognize when you have your most strength and vitality. So if you can time your activity and the type of foods that you're prioritizing at each stage of the cycle, it will really help to optimize your sense of well-being. But it also brings you into the body to be able to connect with the body, understand what's happening within the body, and honor the body as to what's going on for each stage of the cycle. So, just to finish this episode out, I want to tell you about something super exciting that I'll be doing this weekend. So, tomorrow in the RDS, March 2nd and 3rd, I will be present at my stand at the Future Fertility Show. And I'm going to be there talking about all things fertility. I absolutely adore fertility. And I love to talk about how we can get people to a successful space, obtaining hopefully a beautiful baba at the end of the day through a very varying collection of practices. I myself have trained in restorative reproductive medicine. I like to think of myself as someone that sits between the GP setting and the IVF clinic setting. So I tend to optimize people's reproductive health, sperm health, and egg quality through appropriate supplementation, diet plans, lifestyle change. I also recommend menstrual cycle tracking, and I use a specific platform for that so I can see myself how your menstrual cycles are going. And then also, because I prescribe fertility medicines, I tend to look and see where we can optimize things with some medicines. So that's always an option for people who want to go down that route, and I feel that that will benefit them. And it's going to be an amazing weekend. I will have some gorgeous special offers on the fertility packages that I offer, on individual consults, and on womb healing as well. So I really feel that the biggest game changer in my practice with all of the beautiful fertility clients that come through my door has been the shamanic womb healing and trauma release practices that I use within the womb space. Now, we're going to go deep into some of this kind of ancestral wounding that women hold within the womb in our next episode, which I'm super excited about. It's one of my favorite things to talk about. But basically, the practice of healing that I tie into my fertility treatments is shamanic in origin, and has been an absolute game changer. So I'll be offering special discounted rates on those and on my fertility consultations if you pop and see me at my stand next or tomorrow. Tomorrow is super exciting. So we'll see you there if you're going to be about. From my heart to yours, Dr. Anthony.